Last time we charted the crisis-ridden course of the Nikephorian dynasty from 802 to 813. In 811 an emperor was slain by the Bulgars, while 2 years later imperial armies suffered a second great defeat, forcing the final Nikephorian emperor to abdicate in favour of a general named Leo the Armenian. And so all eyes turned to this new emperor, Leo V. He was the fourth in 2 years. All three of his immediate predecessors had been done in by the Bulgars, and now those same Bulgars were marching on the capital. Would Leo avoid his predecessor's fates? Only time could tell, but first we must break from the action to take a look at his early life. Our story starts a decade before Leo took the throne, back during the early years of Nikephorus I's reign, in AD 803. 3 senior officers and their general were visiting a monk not far from the city of Philomelion in Asia Minor. Tales told of how this monk could see the future, and these 4 men, all ambitious to the extreme, all eager to succeed, couldn't resist the temptation of finding out what the future may hold. In due course, they paid the mystic monk a visit, and were told their fates. The general would rise in revolt and be killed for his troubles, the monk said. Yet for the officers he reserved more rosy predictions. 2 of the 3 would become emperor, while the 3rd would die trying. In time all these predictions would come true, or so the legend said. In truth, the story of the mystic monk and his prophecies was an embellishment built up over the centuries, in order to make these early days seem more dramatic than they really were. Even so, the fact remains that under this general, a man named Bardanes Turkos, 3 officers were brought together who would come to dominate the next quarter century of Byzantine history. First was Leo the Armenian, second was Michael the Amorian, and third was Thomas the Slav. All 3 were of humble origins, yet all were capable and hungry for power. Leo and Thomas, as their epithets imply, were of Armenian and Slavic descent respectively, while Michael's family was apparently part of a Judeo-Christian sect from the city of Amorian. Though not obvious friends, a deep brotherly sentiment developed between Leo and Michael over the years. Between Michael and Thomas, on the other hand, there existed little but mutual loathing. In 803, they were still all the officers of their equally ambitious general, Bardanes Turkos, but not for long. That same year, Bardanes rose in revolt against Nikephorus I, and the officers threw their support behind him. Almost immediately, however, it became clear that Bardanes simply didn't have enough support to win. Suddenly, the officers found themselves on the wrong side of a civil war. Leo and Michael thus betrayed Bardanes, defecting to Nikephorus and earning rich rewards as a result. Thomas, meanwhile, slipped east across the border to the Muslim states. With his support rapidly evaporating, Bardanes' revolt was soon over. All in all, Leo and Michael had done well for themselves, showcasing both a slippery opportunism and a keen eye for a bargain that would serve both of them well in later life. Yet Leo's ambition led him astray in 808, when he got involved in a plot against Nikephorus and was exiled as a result. Luckily for him, Leo's time away from home would be brief, for in 811 Emperor Nikephorus was slain in battle against the Bulgars. His son and successor was also paralysed in the battle, so the throne passed to Nikephorus' son-in-law, Michael Rangaby. Emperor Michael, in the wake of such a terrible defeat, needed every capable general he could get his hands on, so Leo the Armenian was recalled to the capital. Over the course of his career thus far, Leo had proven himself both brave and talented, but worryingly ambitious and totally unscrupulous. It probably wasn't a choice the emperor took easily, but Leo was immediately put to work and appointed as strategos, or governor-general, of the Anatolikon theme. He served with distinction, defeating an Arab raid in 812. Then, the following year, he and his soldiers were summoned across to Europe for a major campaign against the Bulgars. The campaign of 813 was little short of a disaster, with Michael's leadership, if you can even call it that, being basically non-existent. In June, Michael finally faced off against Krum, the Bulgar Khan, at a place called Versinikia. Leo the Armenian commanded the left wing of the Byzantine army, but when the time for battle came, his troops deserted the emperor, dooming the imperial army to an ignominious defeat. I've covered this in more detail in my previous video covering the Nikephorian dynasty, so if you haven't watched that then I suggest you do. Emperor Michael escaped the battle, but his reputation was in tatters, and he felt that he could no longer carry on. He had never been a strong man, and 2 years of failure had broken his spirit. Leo, on the other hand, was just getting warmed up. Deeply deceitful and treacherous though his betrayal was, he was careful only to flee the field once all of his men had left, so he avoided accusations of cowardice. And so, carried forth by his own ambition, he hurried back to the capital and prepared to do away with Emperor Michael I. For the 2 years Michael had ruled, he had been an embarrassment to the empire. Everyone was in agreement that a strong new ruler was needed, so they turned to Leo. Upon his return, Michael abdicated and Leo entered Constantinople to be acclaimed emperor. Every succession leads to a certain amount of change in the high command, and Leo's was no different. 2 old friends in particular received big promotions. First was Michael the Amorian, who he appointed to lead the Excubitors, a crack regiment of palace troops. Second was Thomas the Slav, recalled from exile in the east, who he appointed to lead elite troops in the Anatolikon theme. They would stay in these high positions for the rest of Leo's reign, though their rises weren't over yet. In betraying Michael I on the field of battle, Leo had been able to claim the throne, but in doing so he had gambled with the very future of the empire. Leo became emperor on the 12th of July. Only 5 days later the victorious Bulgars arrived before the city, their menacing leader Krum standing at their head. For a few days, the Bulgars busied themselves with strange rituals before the city, offering up sacrifices both human and animal, until negotiations began between Leo and Krum. After some abortive negotiations, Leo proposed that they should meet face to face. They would meet north of the city walls at the shore of the Golden Horn, with Krum arriving by land and Leo by sea. Krum agreed. Initially all went well, but while the two leaders were talking, one of Leo's attendants abruptly put his hands over his face. Thinking quickly, Krum interpreted this as a signal and immediately leapt onto his horse. His quick thinking saved his life, for as Krum sped away, the man standing next to him was cut to pieces by Byzantine soldiers hiding in a bush. It was a typically treacherous act from Leo, and Krum was furious. He made his anger known by torching the suburbs of the capital. The Constantinopolitans themselves remained safe behind their strong walls, but other cities were not so lucky. Fire and blood was visited on all of Thrace. Selymbria was savaged, Redestum reduced to rubble, and the lands around the Dardanelles left a desert. Eventually, he returned to Adrianople, which had been under siege for the past few weeks. The return of the furious Khan broke their will to fight. Adrianople was sacked as well, its people carried off north. Leo tried to sue for peace, but Krum was having none of it. In all fairness, Leo gave as good as he got, slaughtering a Bulgarian army in an ambush. He followed this victory up with a massacre of the local Bulgarian population. Chillingly, we are told that Leo spared the adults, while slaughtering the children. Krum now decided to go all out. The Byzantines had proven themselves treacherous, slippery and cowardly. Bulgaria would never be safe with them on its southern flank, so he decided to destroy the empire once and for all. All throughout 814 he made preparations for a huge assault on Constantinople, building siege weapons and gathering supplies. When the emperor got wind of these epic preparations, he made a few of his own, greatly strengthening the land walls of Constantinople. The stage was set for a massive confrontation, yet it was not to be. History has its fair share of anticlimaxes, and this was one. In April 814, Krum died suddenly, and Byzantium was saved. Krum's son, the young and inexperienced Omotag, faced a revolt at home, so in 815 a 20-year peace treaty was signed between Byzantium and Bulgaria. Just like that, the war which had been the downfall of 3 emperors was at an end, and peace, always a rare visitor to the Eastern Romans, descended over the empire. Now that the situation abroad was calm, the emperor could turn to domestic, or more specifically religious matters. He began to prepare for the return of iconoclasm. Put shortly, iconoclasm was a religious doctrine which held that all pictorial depictions of God, Jesus or saints were sinful and unholy, and as such should be destroyed. In Byzantium, iconoclasm had first become official doctrine in 726 during the reign of Leo III, the first ruler of the Syrian dynasty. Leo III had inherited an empire in chaos, but the appearance of iconoclasm happily coincided with the Byzantine recovery. For Leo III, as well as being a devout theologian, was also a brilliant general. Leo III's son, Constantine V, was also a brilliant iconoclast general. So over time, iconoclasm gained a reputation as the ideology of military victory. Yet the time of iconoclasm had been cut short in 787, when Empress Irene denounced the doctrine at the Council of Nicaea. Ever since then, the empire had been rocked by defeat, and the wars against Krum were just the last in a long series of poor performances. For many, this was no coincidence. The Byzantines had forsaken iconoclasm, seemingly the doctrine of winners, and now God had forsaken them. Every ruler since 787 had ended their reign in failure, food for thought for Leo V during these troubled times. The emperor himself, a pragmatist at heart, had little in the way of religious fanaticism, but he saw this as a possible way to connect himself with the victorious days of the Syrian dynasty, an era of both victory and iconoclasm. So Leo prepared to pave the way for its return, though he made sure to move with caution. There were many who would welcome iconoclasm's return, but there were many others, especially in the church hierarchy, who would not. He began by secretly bringing together a commission of monks to sift through Christian teachings and texts in search of anything vaguely iconoclast. This laborious process took half a year, but by December 814 it was done. The iconoclasts now had all the ammunition they needed. After dropping some unsubtle and menacing hints to the iconophile patriarch Nikephorus, Leo prepared to remove one of Constantinople's biggest icons, a huge image of Christ which hung on one of the gates of the palace. Iconophiles in the capital, Patriarch Nikephorus especially, braced themselves for the gathering storm. In 815, the emperor invited many iconoclast churchmen to the capital. The Patriarch was similarly summoned, and Nikephorus brought with him several high-profile iconophiles to protest against the looming return of iconoclasm. Predictably, this cut little ice with Leo, who had them dismissed and banned from meeting. Then the Patriarch himself was placed under house arrest. Now that everything was in place, a synod was summoned in Easter, which consisted mostly of iconoclasts. In short order, Nikephorus was deposed in absentia and replaced, and after a brief scuffle, iconoclasm finally returned. Iconoclasm had triumphed, but the emperor was moderate in victory. He was still a pragmatist at heart, and there were no witch hunts or persecutions against most iconophiles. Indeed, many icon painters were allowed to carry on so long as they were quiet about it, and only those who really made a nuisance of themselves were punished. However, he did seize rich iconophile monasteries and their lands. Even so, moderate or no, the second iconoclasm led to a major loss of Byzantine art that can still be felt today. But Leo had achieved his aims. Aside from iconoclasm, the emperor harkened back to the good old days of the Syrian dynasty in other ways. For starters, his son Sabbatios, who had been co-emperor since 813, had his name changed to Constantine. The emperors of the Syrian dynasty had alternated between Leo and Constantine until the times of Irene. So by renaming his son, he was once again conjuring up memories of this prior golden age. Just like the Syrians had done, Leo was trying to build a dynasty capable of restoring the empire. If Constantine Sabbatius ever had a son, doubtless he would have been called Leo. But, as fate would have it, he never had a son, and Leo's dynastic ambitions would not survive long. In fact, they would not even outlive him, for a plot was brewing in the most unlikely of places. The friendship of Leo the Armenian and his brother-in-arms, Michael the Amorian, went back a long way. They had served together, of course, under Bardani's Turkos before his revolt, but their bond perhaps went back further still. Leo eventually became the godfather to Michael's son, a boy named Theophilus. Michael, meanwhile, likely supported Leo when he snatched the crown from Emperor Michael I, and was rewarded with command of the Excubitors, an elite palace unit. This is all to say that Leo and Michael were old friends, but for some reason, perhaps it was personal, perhaps it was just crude ambition, that friendship was about to come to an end. As 820 rolled around, Michael the Amorian began speaking slanderously of his emperor. Slanderously but not subtly, Leo quickly caught on and sent an official to give his old friend a talking to. Clearly, the emperor didn't grasp quite how fully Michael had soured, and this slap on the wrist didn't stop the Amorian in the slightest. Instead, Michael carried on his seditious mutterings, until a full-blown conspiracy against Leo was revealed, in which many top officers were implicated. The rank treachery of his old friend jolted Leo into action. Michael was arrested and confronted with undeniable evidence, and so he fully confessed. Yet the emperor's vengeance was not yet slaked, and he immediately ordered Michael thrown into a furnace to have the flesh cooked from his bones. Fortunately for Michael, Leo decided to delay the punishment, mostly because Michael could be pumped for information about the other conspirators, and also because it was Christmas Eve, and the Empress urged for mercy on the eve of such a holy day. It was to prove a terrible mistake. Michael was bunged in prison, the Emperor went to bed. Darkness crept over Constantinople, and Michael sprang into action. He made contact with his fellow conspirators, twisting their arms by saying he would rat on them unless they helped him out. So, in the dead of night, with Christmas Eve giving way to Christmas Day, a hasty plot was patched together. Early in the morning, the Emperor would officiate over a group of choir monks as they sang. It was during the singing that the conspirators would strike. So, with Michael waiting impatiently in prison, the conspirators made their move. In true Assassin's Creed style, they were all dressed in thick monk robes that hid their swords, so they slipped into the monastery where they knew Leo would appear, and sat and waited. In due course the choir assembled and the Emperor arrived. The singing began, with the Emperor himself joining in, and the conspirators inched towards their quarry, until, when the music peaked, they set upon the Emperor with a flurry of sword strikes. By random chance, Leo was standing next to a monk who happened to be wearing the exact same hat as him, so the attackers mistakenly attacked the wrong guy. The poor monk only narrowly escaped an unfortunate end when he threw off his hat. Leo, meanwhile, taking advantage of this brief pause, picked up a heavy wooden cross to defend himself with. Not that it did him much good. A swift sword strike severed his right arm and brought him crashing to the floor, where a second blow relieved him of his head. The Emperor was dead. His replacement was still in prison. The conspirators quickly sprung Michael from jail and brought him to the Hagia Sophia, where this dishevelled, illiterate upstart was proclaimed emperor. Leo's children and wife were packed off to exile, though not before his 4 sons were castrated. As Christmas Day came to an end, Michael II could look back on 24 impressive hours. He had started the day a prisoner and ended it an emperor. Not half bad. Others, however, weren't so impressed. Leo V can be accused of many things, cruelty and duplicity among them, but not stupidity. For the time he had ruled well and with an even hand. Even his enemies begrudgingly admitted his diligence and skill, and Byzantium would have prospered under his rule. They weren't so sure about his successor though. Michael II was a lowly provincial who possessed a pronounced stutter and couldn't read or write. People laughed at his lack of education behind his back, yet they feared him too. His coup was perhaps the most cold-blooded and unjustified in Byzantium's history, and many wondered what other chilling acts he would be capable of in office. The people were certain that Michael just wasn't up to the task. As fate had it though, they were wrong. His lack of education and brutal stutter concealed an otherwise sharp mind. Furthermore, you don't rise from nothing like he did for no reason, and Michael was a far safer pair of hands than anyone liked to admit. Like his predecessor, he was an iconoclast. Also like his predecessor, he was a pragmatist. So the moderate policy of Leo was continued as far as iconoclasm was concerned. In fact, he was even more tolerant, recalling many of those exiled for their iconophile beliefs. Michael would prove a far better ruler than anyone could have expected. Not that this meant his rule would be easy. Far from it. In fact, his 9 years on the throne would see imperial power stretched to the limit by 3 separate crises. The first struck immediately, and Michael is largely to blame. It involved a man we've met before, the third of the 3 officers who served under Bardani's Turkos, a man named Thomas the Slav. After the failed revolt of Bardani's in 803, Leo the Armenian and Michael had defected to the loyalists, but Thomas, if you recall, had fled to Muslim lands. Yet this all changed when Leo V took power in 803. Thomas was invited back, and given the elite troops in the Anatolikon theme. Michael and Thomas had a long-standing rivalry, so the Slav wasted no time in throwing his hat in the ring. And very quickly it became clear that this was no minor rising. Every theme in Asia Minor threw its weight behind Thomas, with the exception of the Opsikion and the Armeniakon. The reasons for this success are several. Firstly, Thomas was a popular, charismatic and well-respected military man, while Michael was either underrated or unknown by many in Anatolia. Furthermore, Leo V had enjoyed lots of support from Asia Minor, and Thomas was able to act under the pretense of avenging the dead emperor. Iconoclasm played little part in the revolt, and Thomas was very vague in his leanings so as not to alienate iconoclasts or iconophiles. He could also count on the support of a few Armenian leaders, although he never had a massive foreign army like some sources suggest. The rebel leader moved quickly to subdue the Armeniakon armies, but before he could move he was attacked by the forces of Caliph al-Mamun. Thomas reacted swiftly, beating them back and counter-attacking so impressively that the Caliph actually agreed to sign an alliance with him. In fact, al-Mamun even allowed Thomas to enter Syria to be crowned emperor by the Orthodox Patriarch of Antioch. The walls were closing in on Michael. In December 821, Thomas crossed the Dardanelles and prepared to lay siege to the capital. His huge force was probably twice what Michael had at his disposal, but the emperor had not been idle, and the capital was well prepared for a siege. Constantinople also benefited from repairs undertaken during the reign of Leo V, who had greatly strengthened the land walls. Due to this, Thomas found his assaults being turned back time after time. In spring 822, after one such reversal, Michael made an appearance atop the walls and addressed his attackers. During his speech, he tried to appear as desperate as possible, in order to lull the attackers into a false sense of security. The plan went perfectly, and the next time the attackers advanced, they did so overconfidently and in poor order. As they approached, the defenders sallied out in large numbers and took Thomas's men by surprise, slaughtering many before falling back. Michael followed this up with a naval victory on the same day. Despite these upsets, neither man was able to force a decisive end to the clash, with the skirmishes continuing for many months. In the end, it would take the Khan of Bulgaria to break the deadlock. Since Krum's death in 814, Bulgaria had been ruled by his son, Omotag. Now securely on the throne, he was ready to take the fight abroad. Michael probably asked for Omotag's help, appealing to the 20-year treaty signed between the two empires in 815, and Omotag agreed. So, in March 823, Omotag met Thomas on the field of battle at a place called Kaduktos. It was not an easy battle. Many fell on both sides, and it's not entirely clear who won, with some saying it was Omotag and others Thomas. Win or lose though, it was devastating for both armies. Omotag had gotten far more than he bargained for from Thomas, and fell back to Bulgaria, while Thomas scooped up the bloodied remains of his army and retreated to a place called the Abbasis. The rebels had been broken, and the Bulgars had been driven off before they did too much damage. When Michael got the news, he could only purr with satisfaction. It was time for him to take the fight to his great rival. Sometime around the start of May, Michael marched out and prepared to face Thomas at Diabasis. When the time for battle came, Thomas tried to use the tactic of feigned retreat to bait out the Amorians' men. But at the critical moment, Thomas's tired and demoralised soldiers refused to fight on, turning this feigned retreat into a real one. The rebel army was shattered. Thomas the Slav fled to Arcadiopolis and hunkered down for a siege. But it was clear to all that his bid for supreme power was over. He was done. Sadly, it would take months of grueling siege warfare to drive that point home, and in October 823, Thomas was handed over by his own men. Michael closed the final chapter on his great rivalry by having Thomas dismembered and impaled. At long last, the Great Revolt, the largest in Byzantine history, was over. The damage it had wrought was terrible, straining imperial resources to the limit. In the wake of such a brutal civil war, Michael II took steps to firm up his legitimacy. He had already proclaimed his son, Theophilus, co-emperor in 821, and when his wife died in 823, he began eyeing up a possible replacement. Her name was Euphrosyne. What made her so attractive to a humble usurper like Michael was her lineage. She was the sole surviving child of Emperor Constantine VI, the emperor who was blinded by his mother Irene, and thus the final member of the Syrian dynasty. One problem though, Euphrosyne was a nun, and second marriages were also deplored in Orthodox Christianity. Michael, however, was not the type of man to get bogged down by these considerations. She was quickly sprung from her monastery and married off to the emperor, in a marriage that was both scandalous and childless. Not that Michael cared. The marriage was a happy one, and he wagered that the legitimacy this marriage provided him far outweighed the scandal of marrying an ex-nun. With his legitimacy enhanced, Michael could get to work running the empire. Unfortunately, he was soon forced to contend with the two other crises that defined his reign, the loss of Crete and the beginning of the end of Byzantine Sicily. As far as these catastrophes are concerned, it's easy to point to the Great Revolt as the reason Byzantium was unable to protect its islands. And while it's true that the revolt did consume nearly all imperial resources, the real reason was far simpler. During the early 9th century, the Byzantine navy was just not strong enough. In previous centuries, the empire had been forced to contend with the strong navy of the Umayyad Caliphate, so Byzantium invested in its own sea power. When the Abbasids took over from the Umayyads in 750, however, they neglected their navy, and so Byzantium's similarly dwindled. There just weren't enough naval threats to justify the expense, or so the Byzantines thought. It was Crete which fell first. In 816, some Andalusian Muslims were expelled from Spain. They settled first in Alexandria before being expelled once more, so they turned their eyes to Crete, a rich and relatively undefended island. They probably made landfall in 825 or 26, swiftly overrunning the island. When the emperor got word of this disaster, he immediately scrambled to retake the island, sending expedition after expedition to Crete. Yet the wily Cretan emir, Abu Hafs, defeated them every time. And so the Muslims were able to entrench themselves in the Aegean Sea, which became the victim of fierce piratical raids for decades to come. Just as the Muslim blitzkrieg of Crete was ending, the Muslim conquest of Sicily got underway. In 826, a Byzantine commander in Sicily called Euphemius rebelled, killing the governor and claiming the throne, but loyalist forces soon boxed him in and drove him into exile. But Euphemius still had moves to make, and chose as his place of exile the Aghlabid Emirate in Africa, where he hoped to gain the support of the Aghlabid ruler, Ziyadat Allah, for another throw at conquering Sicily. The emir couldn't resist the idea of taking the Mediterranean's richest island, and all too happily agreed. The task force set sail in June 827, landing off Sicily's western coast. Euphemius was quickly sidelined and eventually killed by Byzantine soldiers, but the Muslims pressed on, capturing several cities along the southern coast and laying siege to Syracuse in 827. An outbreak of plague and the appearance of the Byzantine navy broke the siege, forcing the Muslims back. They were contained to the southwest, but the Byzantines were not able to dislodge them entirely, and for the rest of the century the imperial province was slowly whittled away. So then, Michael II's reign was not one of peace and tranquility. Some of the crises he faced, like Thomas the Slav's revolt, were really his own fault. Others, like the falls of Crete and Sicily, were symptomatic of a greater Byzantine naval weakness during this period. These crises were the nadir of Byzantine fortunes in this era, and the rest of the century would see the beginnings of a resurgence that would carry on for 200 years. In many ways, Michael II helped lay the stable foundations which buttressed this future growth. For all his faults, he was a remarkably sound administrator and spent the rest of his reign setting the empire back on its feet, while he was always careful not to waste money, and the treasury looked far healthier by the end of his reign. Indeed, in this regard, he was quite lucky, because, for some unexplained reason, imperial revenues leapt massively towards the end of Michael II's reign. Some have suggested the opening of new gold mines, but it's not entirely clear. Perhaps the most lasting benefit Michael conferred on Byzantium was the establishment of a strong and stable dynasty, something lacking ever since the downfall of the Syrian dynasty in 802. His son, the intellectual and energetic Theophilus, stood ready to carry the banner forward, so when Michael finally breathed his last in 829, he could die knowing that the empire was in safe hands. His new Amorian dynasty, first through his son Theophilus and then through his grandson Michael III, provided newfound stability that helped Byzantium take advantage of its improved position relative to its neighbours. But this is where we leave the story for now.